Welcome to the first episode of Fuzzy Logic, the podcast that breaks down the incentive structures in our society and who stands to benefit from the status quo. I'm Matt Haller, a technology executive and incentive design expert who has built more than $3 billion in incentive programs for companies like Microsoft and Siemens. Joining me is my partner in crime and co-host, Chris Michaud.
I'm Chris Michaud, a management consultant and process expert solving complex commercial problems for Fortune 500 companies. I've also designed over 100 different incentive programs and led revenue operations teams.
Tell us some of the things that you're most excited about this season.
Well, I think, you and I have been talking about this for a long time. And I think just given our backgrounds we've designed so many incentives, but thinking about that outside of pure business context and more like, things like how do you tip people and why should you buy a house and what does it mean to incent in the community? So all of those things I'm pretty excited about and more.
One of the things that you and I have talked about pretty extensively is that when we have an incentive structure in place, when there are certain processes that those incentive structures reinforce, we can kind of have this almost effective blinders on, right? We will take these structures, these systems at face value, but what we want to do is try to unpack them a little bit more, understand a little bit about who stands to benefit from those structures. So when we'll talk about housing, why are we building and incentivizing builders to build certain kinds of houses? What's the incentive for us to build affordable housing across the country? When we talk about healthcare, why do we keep saying that we care about healthcare costs coming down, yet they only seem to go up and we don't feel like we have a choice or any bargaining power? Our society's changing a lot. And I think that pace of change is happening at a faster rate than it has taken place in history. So as we start to change and evolve and experience some of these different processes and systems in a new world, really trying to think more critically about who stands to benefit and how we can support our listeners in unpacking that world.
Really thinking about it in the sense of how we live it every day, how we got here in the first place, what we think those implications are for folks and people who live it day by day will be really interesting to explore.
So with that, it's time for our first Fuzzy Logic story. A recent article from the New York Post says that, quote, tipping culture is out of control. The report, based on a study by the company Coupon Birds, highlights how tipping attitudes and practices are changing for both consumers and service workers alike. What do they find? Well, customers are leaving smaller tips at fewer places, indicated by only 24% of Gen Z saying they, quote, always tip hairstylists and barbers, compared to 40% of millennials and 67% of Gen X. This trend continues across other categories, including food delivery and taxi ride services. Reasons given for the disparity between generations have been wealth inequality, philosophical beliefs on using tipping as a means to supplement wages, and, quote, tip creep, as consumers are increasingly being given the option to tip for self-checkout services, convenience stores, and other locations where the concept of tipping is foreign to the American mind. Chris, what's the history of tipping?
Yeah, I mean, you got me worried about the tip creep running around my neighborhood dressed in a cape, shaking a change jar, asking for tips. But no, seriously, if we go back, I mean, kind of how did we get here, right? So if we go all the way back to the ye old Middle Ages, right, in Europe, actually, which is ironic because, tipping in Europe is not as prevalent as it used to be. But back then, it was basically a way of upper class members being able to give lower classes extra money for their services. And that practice essentially trickled over to the US in kind of slow streams, but there were a couple things that really happened, call it post-Civil War. One, you suddenly now had a lot of people who before you didn't have to pay, and now you have to with the end of slavery. So thinking about that, companies wanted to keep their costs down. So what's the best way to do that? Pass the cost on to the consumer in the form of a tip. And then at the exact same time, you had the railroads. So Transcontinental Railroad was completed not too long after Civil War. That needed a huge source of traveling cheap labor at extremely low cost. So Pullman, both car builder and railroad operator, also evil Robert Brer, and if you ever go visit his grave in Chicago, there's 12 feet of concrete above it. So definitely won hearts and minds. Basically hired ex-slaves because they were so good at service and were willing to work for low wages. So that's kind of how we got to before turn of the century. Then it kind of bounced back and forth. So we had a roller coaster ride in the sense that some people were really pushing against it. William Howard Taft, our most corpulent president, but also Supreme Court Justice. So worthless trivia there. He was really the patron saint of anti-tipping. And so when he ran for president, he actually campaigned on it. And there were some other states like South Carolina, Iowa, that had anti-tipping laws, But basically, right before the Depression, almost all of those laws were completely gone. So tipping had been essentially immersed in culture by the Great Depression. So then it became a different argument, which was who gets to keep the tip. So who would have even thought about it, right? I would think if I did the service, I'd want the tip. But believe it or not, we had to go to the Supreme Court to get that authorized. So in 1942, they ruled that the exclusive right to the tip was the employee. So fast forwarding a bit, when you got to the 1960s, there was finally this division. So everyone talks about this, right? Like tip workers are paid in the sub minimum wage category, that the rest would be made up by tips. The problem is twofold. One, sometimes that doesn't happen, as we'll talk about with folks later. But also, it hasn't changed since 1996. So it's been $2.13 an hour. So even if we just adjust it for inflation, it'd be like $4.50 right now. So, even in the sense of where it was last left off versus now, on even a base wage, tipped workers are kind of getting the shaft, if you will. So now other states have rocked the boat, like Vermont has raised it a bit. California, of course, Washington State has a minimum wage that's tied to whether you're tipped or not. So history has taken us kind of left, right, and sideways. But the reality is, after kind of back to that Civil War argument, it really hasn't changed much since the 19th century.
Seems like tipping in and of itself is not wholly an American concept. The way that we do it and the way that we hold on to it today certainly seems to be unique around the world. But the practice of using tipping to supplement wages and drive certain behaviors is not new. What I think is interesting is that we talk about it as if it is good for the employee. And we say, this is your opportunity to go and earn as much money as you want. You deliver really great service. People are going to tip more. But we need to contextualize that incentive structure within culture and society today. And so what I think is interesting to me about hearing about how America has historically thought about tipping is that we take it for granted. We assume that it's something that should be part of our discourse, but it's there because for a large majority of our history, it's benefited specifically people who own businesses, but businesses that benefit from having low payroll costs because they already have higher costs associated with them. Right? Look at a restaurant, for example, extremely expensive to run, low margin, adding in a payroll tax and being able to pay people a living wage on top of that. There's not really a financial incentive for a business to want to do that. So it's easier to pass that cost on to the consumer in the form of this practice of tipping.
Yeah, I mean, it'd be an interesting concept to do an analysis to say, okay, as the patron, so you and me going to eat in a restaurant, like, would I actually pay more or less if I had a non-tipping standard wage? I'm guessing we would pay more for the meal, but the question is, if you talk about a very exceptional service, like in a Michelin-starred restaurant, chances are your cost probably would be not that much different. And a lot of those places pay better wages anyway. So it goes back to the story of, if you want to eat cheaply, which in the US, I would argue it's cheaper to go out to eat in most cases than it is to cook it at home versus Europe or some other places. I think you're going to get some resistance from people saying, okay, well, I'm still willing to tip and I'd rather do that culture because I could get my, chain meal for $9.99, right? 3-course meal or whatever it is.
I don't think that we can ignore inflation as part of this conversation as well, because people's ability to add additional dollars to their bill when they're going out to dinner is going to be tied to how much free cash flow that they feel like they have available.
You've already seen it. I mean, you've seen where people have gone and said, okay, either I'm going out to eat less or I'm trading downward. I mean, even the chain restaurants have said this, right? They're like, we've noticed our people have traded down. Fast casuals now they don't have to tip, thankfully, but fast casuals kind of got squeezed in the middle, right? So yeah, inflation's definitely a thing. I mean, and we haven't seen it in 40 years. So, I mean, go find a restaurateur who had to deal with inflation. He or she is probably retired or dead, right? So, I mean, this is the first time we've had to deal with it in a long time. So thinking about that, it's going down, but it's not going away. So how do you deal with that going forward? The other part of it too is, if you think about inflation tips that are adjusted inflation, like the restaurant bill, but think about tips that you and I would think about that aren't necessarily inflation adjusted, like tipping a valet driver, right? To get your car. That $1 or $2 has been the same for 10, 15, 20 years. Well, $1 20 years ago isn't worth anywhere as much now as it would have been back then. So I think there's some folks that are in kind of, I'll call it static tip industries, that are probably suffering a hell of a lot more than those that have been able to take advantage of some of the increases in restaurant ticket.
I think that's a really great call out, and that we're in this moment in the United States or essentially the world, the tipping world, where multiple forces are coming together to influence the way that we experience that interaction. So at the end of the day, that tipping moment is an interaction between a customer, a service provider, and the point of that is for better service, you get better wages. That's been the promise. But as the job changes, as we require fewer people to do less complex tasks, as we try to drive more standardization across your restaurant experiences, the idea that you have that above and beyond moment, the opportunity to really say, I'm going to go as a service provider, really take care of these people because I'm expecting that they are going to give something back, is being challenged. And I'm excited today because we're going to be able to talk to two people on the podcast. One person, Schae, on the front lines of the tipping culture, working in the hospitality industry, and then Gary working in finance and strategy for an online payments platform that will help us tease apart those two components. What's happening with the customer interaction? What are the behaviors that we're trying to drive? And then is the way that we're facilitating that interaction, especially in a digital age, is that really driving those behaviors that we're looking for?
Yeah, it becomes very interesting, and they'll have great perspectives on it because automation will continue to happen in the rise of just your base costs are going up. I mean, to your point a few seconds ago around restaurant owners, I think most restaurant owners, if they could afford it, would pay, right? I think just the way that the cost structure exists for a restaurant and its service industry and being able to run those things, it's almost like you would have to transform an entire business model to either, if you were on the side of anti-tipping, if you're on the side of pro-tipping, you're probably like, all right, I'm just going to continue to do a good job. The other layer is the whole COVID thing, I think, changed people who were really good at this industry, stepped out of it for 2 years and said, you know what, I can have a much better work-life balance. I don't need to deal with this anymore. And they found that their wages weren't that much different. So to think about the skilled labor in that space that now has disappeared from the market is going to say, okay, well, wait a minute, how do I get that back? And I might not get that back, so I need to automate. So there's probably a bit of a, yes, cost component, but also I don't have enough people to do that anymore.
We're going to take a quick break. Coming up is our first guest, Schae Beaudoin, a veteran of the hospitality industry, who's going to talk to us about how the relationship between customers and service providers is changing the world of tipping.
And then we'll talk with Gary Ludorf, who is a fintech expert and will give us the view of how this happens in restaurants, stores, and other solutions.
Welcome back to Fuzzy Logic. Our first guest is Schae Beaudoin, a veteran of the hospitality industry, working in both events and traditional bar and restaurant environments. Welcome to Fuzzy Logic, Schae.
Thanks for having me.
I'm sure you've seen many examples of tipping, both good and bad, over the years. To you, what's the purpose of tipping and what role do you believe it's supposed to play in the interaction with the customer?
Yeah, I think there's kind of two purposes to tipping. The economic aspect, where we know that service workers are not, in some places they are, in many places are not paid minimum wage, so they make the majority of their living off of tips. And then there's also the social aspect of someone will tip an amount based on the service that they feel they provided. So it can be, a variable amount based on whether somebody liked the service or felt that the service they got was adequate. So there's kind of like a whole socioeconomic tie-in to tipping.
What do you think are the pros and cons of this structure from your perspective? And how do you feel like the promise of what tipping as a construct is setting out to do actually plays out in reality?
The pros, for sure, like I said, in terms of workers being able to pay their bills and things like that, there's people that make 90% of their living off of tips. So I think, it's important when we are going out to get some of these nicer services that are maybe not essential services, that we're remembering to tip people and tip them adequately, because it is really the way that a lot of people feed their families and pay their bills. In terms of cons, I definitely think that there's pressure in terms of tipping. I think everybody's feeling the social pressure of tipping today. So I think there's a bit of awkwardness surrounding it, or maybe even a bit of confusion too, where people aren't sure what they're supposed to tip or how much they should tip, or what is considered a good tip and what's not. I think there's definitely subjectivity to it that can lead to a bit of confusion among different patrons and even service workers themselves. I think it's become a little bit more of a contentious social discussion at this point. I still think there are merits to tipping, at least with the way that we currently have everything structured in our society. But I think people are getting a little restless, maybe.
Yeah, Schae, I'm sure there's been a tipping fatigue, but have you noticed that fatigue bleed into like things that 5 years ago, as you mentioned, we would tip for and would, for great service would tip generously? Like, has that changed? So even now, assuming the same level of service, are people tipping less, or has that been consistent?
I don't know that I've noticed people tipping less, to be honest. In terms of like the work that I do, it's typically bartending. So I've done, serving and things like that too. And I think those are typically services that have kind of always been tipped professions. So I don't feel I've seen too much of a change.
It sounds like as we talk about tipping, there is this idea that you can make more money if you deliver a better service is motivational. Can you describe a time that tipping influenced the way that you did your job and what considerations led to that behavior change?
Yeah. Anyone that works in restaurants will usually tell you that there's some type of tipping out system. So when you tip your server, 100% of your tip might not go to your server. Some of that might go to the bartender because they're helping make drinks for the table. Some of it might go to the bussers because they're helping clean up the tables and turn the tables over for the next people. So I've worked in places where there's kind of like a bit of contention over like the tip out, or like, are the bartenders getting tipped out in the way that they should be? So sometimes you'll focus 100% on your customers that are tipping you directly, maybe not 100% because you have to help the whole place run, but you're going to give your priority attention to those customers that are tipping you directly because that's your moneymaker versus like, you might have some drink tickets piling up, but the servers are going to have to wait because that's, you're one person and you have to prioritize how you're going to take care of your service, especially when it's a busy night.
Yeah, Chris and I, our experience is mostly designing incentive plans for sales teams. But one of the things that we've definitely said to each other over and over and over again in our careers is people are going to do exactly what they are paid to do. No more, no less. And so it's really interesting when you describe the tip out process that as a business owner, you might say, we have a great tipping program. We try to share some of that income across the team to influence our team's behaviors. But the way that we are actually distributing that money influences the behavior of our teams and potentially not always the most desirable ways.
Yeah, 100%.
Maybe one point to that point around the tipping out process, Schae, does the restaurant say, okay, it's mandated kind of XYZ, or is that up to the discretion of the server themselves to decide how much and where they want to do that tip out?
It's typically mandated by owners or managers. They'll say, 5% of your tips go to the bartenders that night because that's their fair split for making the drinks for your table. So it's usually decided by management to avoid any kind of conflict or anything like that.
Schae, do you think that tipping should stay how it is today, or do you think that it should change?
I think people would be a lot happier if it changed, probably on like the service side and the patron side. I don't know about you guys, but when I go out to eat and I see that there's like the tip already calculated or any like potential like mathematical errors, it kind of just makes things easier for everybody, I think. Whether we talk about building that into restaurant prices and just having restaurants raise their prices a little bit to completely eliminate the practice of tipping, or you're talking about building in a 18 to whatever 22% service fee, assuming that it is a tip. I know there's kind of been discussion about service fees and whether those are tips or not, which is probably a discussion for a whole other day. But if I see like a service fee included and I know that that's a tip going, I kind of like to have that built into my bill. I think just taking some of the guesswork out of tipping would make everyone on the customer side happier and maybe take some of that pressure and the tipping fatigue that we were talking about away. I think it can change and it should change. I don't know if it will, but I think it can be better than it is right now for sure.
Do you think having a service charge that's sort of blanket spread or a standard tip that's spread across the entire restaurant, will that change people's behaviors? Or do you think it's more the stability aspect that would make everybody happier?
I think definitely the stability aspect of it is kind of what I was referring to, but the like behavioral aspect is obviously like something you'd want to think about too. I've seen a lot of great workers keep being great workers in spite of getting bad tips and dealing with difficult customers. So I would like to think that it wouldn't really compromise the quality of somebody's work. I think if somebody is going to do the bare minimum, they might just do the bare minimum. And if somebody's going to go above and beyond, they're going to go above and beyond, as long as they're still feeling like what they're putting in is worth it. So like I said, I think just making sure that workers have that stability is probably going to be key to that.
I think back to the point that you made around how the incentive structure within a restaurant operates. And the first thing that you mentioned wasn't that tipping is the most effective thing for the relationship between the server and the customer, but you did say that it changes the behavior of the way that people think about their tips and what they prioritize within the industry. And it almost begs the question, is tipping really, really that incentive motivational compensation construct for the service industry? Or is it seem more from an employee perspective as a rationale to keep costs low for the restaurant and offer this promise of being able to earn more?
The latter sounds like something that is more familiar with me. I do think, like, we all know that restaurants are like just a huge like initial cost, and like there's so many expenses associated with it. I think it does make sense to try to keep expenses as low as possible from a business owner perspective by having workers make the majority of their money through tips and through their interactions with customers.
So Schae, if you were to wave a magic wand and be able to see into the future, what do you think the future of tipping is?
I think either we talk about building it into restaurant prices and doing away with tipping altogether. I think that would probably make most people happy, as probably not restaurant owners. Everybody else, I think, might be happy with that. Or we talk about like building in a service charge towards the end of the bill to kind of take that variable question away and give workers more of a stable total at the end of the night versus like, oh, we had a slow night, so I didn't make as much tonight, or oh, I had a crazy busy night, I couldn't even stay on top of everything, but I made a bunch of money. Like, I think creating just a bit more stability, I think, would help customers get better service, and it would help servers just be stable.
Yeah, I think the takeaway you're getting at is if servers and professionals feel more stable, they're going to be much happier than kind of the system we have right now.
Yeah, I would agree.
Cool. Well, hey, look, we really appreciate you taking the time to join us. So appreciate the insights, and thanks so much, Schae.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. This was great.
Coming up, our second guest will be Gary Ludorf, who will bring us more on the fintech side. So stay with us.
Calling all B2B sales executives. Ready to elevate your sales game? Meet Compose Comp, your partner in sales incentive excellence. Our tailored solutions blend expert design with tech innovation, ensuring your reps have the confidence to close deals. Take the first step to sales success. Visit composecomp.com and schedule your consultation now.
Welcome back. Our second guest today is Gary Ludorf. Gary is the Vice President of Strategy and Finance for Astra Finance, an online payments processing company that works with developers who develop point-of-sale solutions for retail, restaurants, and stores, among other things. Welcome to the podcast, Gary. It's great to have you here.
Hey, Chris. Hey, Matt. Great to be here.
So maybe before we get into anything, why don't you give us a bit of your background intro and how you play in the tipping realm?
Absolutely. I think the most relevant piece of experience I have comes from the time I spent at a restaurant point-of-sale company called Toast. At Toast, which makes some of those points of sales for restaurant that kind of look like iPads, like tablets. I'm sure folks are very familiar with them at this point. I worked on the fintech strategy team. Part of that included digital tipping. So I have a lot of experience in payments processing, digital tipping, especially when it comes to restaurant and service workers.
The post-pandemic world has seen just an absolute explosion of those digital payment solutions, and especially in the retail and restaurant space. Do you see a difference in the way that consumers experience tipping based on that?
Absolutely, Matt. So I think in the post-COVID world, with an influx of digital tipping, the tipping experience for consumers has changed probably in what I'd say two very important ways. One, I think consumers are encouraged or even forced to tip more often than they would have otherwise. And two, I think it also encourages consumers to tip in places where they would not have usually tipped. Overall, there should be some really good, strong trends for those who earn tips, but pushed too far, there could certainly be consumer backlash that has a negative effect to tipping overall.
And have you seen that where you've gone out and deployed some of these solutions? I imagine some organizations have said, yes, let's embrace this, and we want more of the options to be able to reward our staff. And others have said, okay, this might be too much fatigue. I have 20 of these different options now. So how have you seen organizations balance that?
Definitely, Chris. And that's the key word there. It's a balance. Post-COVID, it's been really hard to hire in the service industry. One of the incentives for someone to go work in the service industry is tipping, especially digital tipping, because we've seen just a proliferation of it, and it increases tipping overall. So it's almost table stakes if you work in an industry and need to hire folks who are tip earners. On the other side, there's well-documented consumer backlash to how tipping has popped up everywhere, whether it's written in the Wall Street Journal or as a meme on Twitter. So you do have to strike the balance. And I think it's just being keyed into what are the norms.
I had this experience at a restaurant recently where after we're done with our meal, server comes and brings the little payment device, and on the screen it offers you the ability to do a tip, but the server's standing right there and watching you fill out the form. And on the one hand, you can say you've got to be accountable for how much you're going to tip, and on the other hand, that really fundamentally changes the way that people experience tipping and how much they should tip. And I think it provides way more pressure to tip in a place where we otherwise are not as comfortable.
Definitely. I had that experience just the other day where the credit card machine came over to me and the default tip selection was 30%. And the other options on the screen were 28 and 32%. Quite frankly, that is a lot more than I generally tip.
When you sell these solutions or when people buy these types of devices, I'm assuming they set their own defaults. So like it's the restaurant that's sort of encouraging that, or is that like a package solution that, is just defaulted to? I'm curious. I don't know if any of us know that, so I call me a fintech novice, but would love to know how that works.
At the end of the day, whoever owns the POS system, the merchant, the restaurant, what have you, they have an extreme degree of control over what numbers pop up when the tipping screen shows up. These tipping systems, whether it's Square, Toast, any other POS, have an extreme degree of flexibility built into the system to do tips any which way you might want to do it. Do you tip on top of tax? Do you not tip on top of tax? What are the default percentages? Or is it a default dollar amount? They can support all of that. That is part of their value add, is being able to serve your tipping solution however it is that you want. So when you do see what might feel like an insanely high percentage as the default tip, at the end of the day, it's the restaurant owner who did that.
That's really fascinating.
When you think about kind of where this is headed from a digital payment perspective, how do you think fintech will influence tipping and the changes that we're seeing now and maybe things in the future that we're not thinking about?
Sure. If we think of the evolution of the tip jar, where you go to your coffee shop, throw a few quarters in a coffee mug that was at the register, that was sort of the first wave of tipping. Now the second wave is the digital POS, the iPad tablet, you're typing it in, pushing a button. I think the next wave, and fintech will support this, is going to be much more direct customer to tip earners. So much so that I think we might even see over the next 5-10 years, apps that are specifically like a Venmo for tipping, where most service workers have this app and you scan their QR code or something and tip them directly outside of, any POS system. I think that's a trend we're seeing. It's one that Astra as a payments company can help support, instant payments from a consumer to a tip earner. And I think that might be the way the tipping industry moves.
Do you see a scenario where digital plays a role of in lieu of the server, right? Do you see that happening already with the solutions you offer, or is this still a far out idea?
Definitely. I don't want to scare anyone. I don't think automation and digital solutions are coming for anyone's job in the server industry tomorrow. But over time, as there are struggles to hire quality talent in service industry, I do think digital solutions are going to play a huge role. There's a burger place near me where they no longer have a cashier to take your order. You go to a digital kiosk and you order yourself. And actually, it's a pretty nice experience because I can take my time, do what I want to do, read the menu, check out all myself.
Did it have an option to tip on the digital kiosk or no?
In this specific one, no. But I'm certain that many of them do. You check out by yourself and then you're expected to put a tip. And it's like, well, to whom am I paying this to?
And what's interesting about that tip is that because it's not specifically a tip going directly to a server, they can be treated as revenue by the company, which means not all those dollars might not actually make it to the employees in a tip the way that you thought that you were contributing to in the first place.
That's a really important point, Matt. Tipping laws vary state by state, and they're very different, and they can be kind of difficult to navigate around and stay in compliance with. I live in Boston, Massachusetts. Here, back of house staff are not allowed to be tipped. So it does create some interesting dynamics and challenges, frankly, when it comes to pooling tips and paying everyone in the service industry a fair wage.
So I always like to sort of end some of these things with a fun story. So what's the most bizarre request you've ever seen for a tip?
Good question. I've seen quite a few bizarre ones, and I keep my eyes open for it as someone who has a lot of experience in digital tipping. But most recently, I was in an airport last weekend, and I bought a bottle of water at a convenience store, and I couldn't figure out how not to tip for the bottle of water. Already, I'm at an airport. I pick up my own bottle of water. I bring it to the cashier. And it's, of course, price gouging. It was like a $6 bottle of water. And I couldn't figure out how not to tip on that. So I tipped $1. So it was one of the most expensive bottles of water I've ever purchased. I'm going to throw one more in. When I travel, I go to the ATM specifically and I get a bunch of singles because, tipping a bellhop or a bartender in cash, people actually really appreciate that. It's a little old school, but putting like something more physical, more tangible back into the tipping space is actually really appreciated.
That's a good place to leave it. So thanks so much for stopping by, Gary. We're going to take a quick break, then come back and talk about our predictions for the future.
Hey B2B sales pros, want to maximize your team's performance? Discover Compose Comp, your key to optimize sales incentives. We blend expertise and technology to give your reps the edge they need to close deals. Don't settle for ordinary. Visit composecomp.com and unlock your team's full potential today.
Welcome back to Fuzzy Logic. From the inception of tipping to what our guests, Schae and Gary, have been sharing on their segments, this has been really quite a journey into the history and the way that we experience tipping today. Now let's talk some clear logic. What say you, Chris?
I got one big word out of what we heard from both Gary and Schae today, and that was stability. I think people are looking for some solution to tipping that creates stability both for the customer, but also for the server themselves.
I think one of the more poignant insights came from Gary, where we were talking about the flexibility that restaurant owners have to change the default settings of their point of sale solutions. And it made me think about how there's far more complexity to the way that servers and bartenders earn their tipping, what you and I would call crediting. And that really does influence people's behavior. So realizing that there's such a deeper world to the way that not just how much we want to tip, but the way that those dollars are distributed was something that I hadn't considered before.
Yeah, we always think about we just kind of go pay for something and pay for the tip. The digital aspect was unique, I agree, in the sense that restaurants really have a lot of control over it. And I don't think most guests sort of realize that versus in the old days where if you were doing that non-digitally, you could just write down whatever tip you wanted. And to that point, around the kind of experience, you both talked about it with the whole bringing the iPad in front of you and then having to pick that tip. I think that's created a bit more fuzzy logic than clear logic, if you will, but getting that right. And maybe, Venmo or some QR code that each server has for themselves. There's a whole lot of solutions that I think we're going to see on the horizon that both Schae and Gary alluded to in the future.
Yeah, I mean, I like that Schae was helping us uncover the fact that working in a restaurant is still a team sport. Right? Maybe you can have a dive bar where it's just one bartender and they're really doing everything themselves. But when you're trying to run a little more of a complex operation, it's not just about how I'm incentivizing this one server, this one customer to participate in that transaction. It's really about making sure that all of these people can work together effectively. And perhaps being able to pay staff directly is the answer. But I also have to think there must be some world where we can just say the consumer wants stability and wants to know how much something is going to cost when they're going out. So can we give them that stability and give them that fixed fee? Will that have some kind of a negative impact on that customer's experience?
Yeah, restaurants have started trying it. I think higher end restaurants have had a better experience with this because just simply the ticket prices are much higher. And you've seen it in some of those areas. But I think when you get down to more, and Gary kind of alluded this too, right? We're not going to replace servers with kiosks, but it will help augment some of those experiences where we do want human interaction versus those times where we might be in a hurry and we actually are looking more for efficiency rather than intimacy.
So what predictions do you think that we can see or expect in the tipping world in the next 2 to 3 years?
I'm going to be bold. I'm going to say we've reached about peak tip. I think things going forward will be less of tip for this, tip for that, tip for a new option. I think it's going to be more streamlined in the sense that there are certain things that everyone agrees will be core tipping and people are fine with it. I think some other options are going to come into play that kind of augment that experience, but aren't necessarily going to be creative.
I completely agree. I think that we are going to start to move towards a world where consumers push back on the idea that tipping is really ubiquitous and everywhere. We've already started to see a lot of that. And I think that there's a nice trend in comparison between the workers' rights, labor movement, paying people their fair wage for roles where tipping might not be able to influence their behavior as well, but then doubling down on places where if the goal is to drive a certain behavior or outcome and that person has control over it, true control over that experience, then tipping could be a good way to make a living.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I think it's the quality of that tip. So I think you're going to see more quality tips, but the quantity of the available options to tip will probably drop off.
Well, Chris, I think that we have sufficiently talked about tipping on this episode. And I think that's a wrap for our first episode of Fuzzy Logic.
Thank you to all of our guests for sharing their thoughts. Fuzzy Logic is produced by Mitchell Rissmiller. New episodes come out every Wednesday. Thanks so much.